Hey guys, this is Nate with Joke of All Trades, and today we're going to take a look at how to face your tunic. A lot of people have trouble with necklines on their tunics or other garments. This is specifically geared toward Viking Age tunics for reenactment. I do want to say, first of all, that facing is not necessarily a historic technique for the early medieval period. Not until much later, as a matter of fact. However, while most historic necklines for this period would have been rolled edges, that can be a real pain in the ass to do sometimes with a neckline. And this is a quick and easy way to get it done and have it look perfect every time. A lot of people overthink this. It's not rocket science, guys. It's very, very easy once you know what you're doing. And hopefully after you watch this video, that'll be you. So the facing technique I'm going to show you today, this is all about the path of least resistance, okay? I'm a lazy bastard. I like to do things the easy way whenever possible. So, to make this easier, make yourself a template just like you see here. This is a simple 6-inch circle, and I have lines on it that show me where the halfway mark is, where the 1/3 mark is, and where the 1/4 mark is with respect to that circle. The cross in the center shows me how to center it and keep it straight when I lay it on the tunic so that I can draw out my neckline. This is probably the most important thing in getting this right, because if you don't have a template, it is super easy to get your circle coming out wonky, not quite round, too thin on one part, too fat on the other part, and it just comes out looking ugly. So just take 5 minutes, get yourself a piece of crappy cardboard, draw yourself a little template like this. For a long time, actually, I was using, you see next to this, the little fabric circle. That was actually part of a neckline that I previously cut out, and I just doodled on it with chalk. And when that wore out, I decided to upgrade to crappy cardboard. So it's not hard, just make yourself a template, it'll make your life easier. Alright, so what am I looking at here? This is the body of the tunic, and you can see I have a line drawn from one side to the other. That is where the shoulders will be. So if you fold your tunic lengthwise exactly in half, mark that line where that is folded, and that is the halfway point. That's where it should sit on your shoulders. The circle there, drawn in chalk, is where the neckline will go. Now you don't want the circle to be exactly centered on that line. You want it to be offset. That's why we have the 1/3 and 1/4 mark. It's whatever you prefer. It can be either. It depends on how your body is shaped. I used to do 1/3 all the time, but I've really started doing 1/4, and I find that that's more comfortable for the way my shoulders and my long ass neck sits. It just seems to be more comfortable. So that's what I've been doing. Now the line down the middle of the circle that you see extends past the bottom of the circle, that is for the keyhole, and it also helps keep the circle straight. Now your keyhole is generally going to be 3 inches. That is historically attested to in early medieval tunics. It's usually around that length for the surviving examples we have. It's also attested to in period art for when that comes up in slightly later periods. And generally speaking, a 6-inch hole with a 3-inch neckline is pretty much going to fit everybody. So this is me kind of showing how I make a template with the circle lining up and being offset. Now this is not actually where the template goes. There's another step here, but what I'm doing here in drawing this circle and these lines is making sure that everything is going to be centered and exactly where we want. So you know you have a 6-inch circle, so you need to measure out from one end of the tunic to the other along that shoulder line and figure out exactly where 6 inches would be centered. And it's very important that you do that. Same with the neckline, or I'm sorry, with the keyhole, making sure the keyhole is centered and straight. It's, you know, you don't have to get the protractor out or anything, but it's important that it's correct. Otherwise, it's going to, when it's finished, it's going to look weird. And you don't want that. Also, iron your fabric and quarantine your cats. Don't be lazy like me. So now we know where we want it to go. The next step is to cut the actual piece of facing fabric. So the technique of facing is using a separate piece of fabric to finish your neckline for you. So you don't have to roll any hems or do any of that business. It's all done. Makes it much easier. And the reason it's called facing is because it's done by facing the facing is the upside of the fabric, right? Well, that's where you're sewing this. You're sewing this on the exterior, the upside of the tunic. It's not on the back where all the seams are, it's on the front. Which seems counterintuitive, but I promise it'll all work out. So what you need is you get another piece of your fabric that's the same as your tunic, or you can do it contrasting if you want. Doesn't really matter. And you measure out a square. You want it to be at least 9 inches by 12 inches. You can do 12 inches by 12 inches if you are concerned you're going to come up short or make a mistake or something. That's fine. But it needs to be at least 9 by 12, assuming you're doing a 6-inch circle with a 3-inch keyhole. Please ignore the constant feline assault. Sewing is a trial when you have a house full of cats. Alright, so here is my facing square, or rectangle as it were, 9 inches by 12 inches, and I'm going to lay it long side so that the longer end is where the keyhole goes. That is why it is 9 by 12 and not just 9 by 9. Gotta have that extra 3 inches for the keyhole. So I'm going to put it here and I'm going to measure and make sure that it is centered, just like we did with the template when it was going down on the tunic fabric. Now I'm going to do that again on the facing fabric. Now you don't have to do that first part where you draw everything out on the tunic. You could just do it with the facing. However, if you're as ADHD scatterbrained as I am, it really helps to have that stuff marked down on the tunic so that you can make sure you're correct when you do it on the facing. None of that is going to be visible anyway. You know, just use chalk so that it can dust off. But you mark all of that over again, just the same exact way that you did before, onto the facing fabric. And again, this is where you want to use your template to make sure that you have the circle offset correctly and all your lines are straight. The template will really help with that. I made my keyhole line a little long. I drew that little line at the end there, so it looks kind of like the, you know, the female circle with a line, you know, the little image for that. It looks kind of like that. Plus sign with the circle. That line is at 3 inches. Now there's a purpose for that because we have to kind of sew in a specific way when we get to that. So it's very important that there be a nice crisp line at the end of it. You can just make a 3-inch mark with the chalk as long as you know that you need to stop there when you sew. That's fine if you want to do it that way. What matters is the result, not how we get there, right? It is worth noting, however, that if you do not have the facing square aligned correctly, or you have the circle drawn in the wrong spot or the keyhole is off kilter, the result will be an uncomfortable, ill-fitted neck hole that you can't fix without remaking the tunic. So even me, as lazy as I am, doing that first step really is in the best interest of getting a nice quality product at the end. So you can see here I'm laying the facing square down and making sure that it's centered and aligned. I have the tunic spread out so that there's no other fabric beneath it, because we are going to pin it in place. Now you kind of have to pin it a specific way. The center of the circle on the inside of the circle, because we're not actually sewing around the edges. We are sewing around the circle line. I'm going to use a cheater machine for this because this tunic that I'm making here is actually a combat tunic that I don't care about, basically making it with scrap fabric. If you want to hand sew this, you can absolutely do that. However, if you're hand sewing it, it's probably because you want it to be historically authentic. And if you want it to be historically authentic, you should probably be doing rolled seams, not facing. So, if you are using a cheater machine like me, make sure you pin it so that your pins are out of the way. You want to kind of set them into the circle, maybe half an inch. And then I like to put a row of pins on the outside of the circle as well, also half an inch, so it gives me like an inch of clearance for me to get my sewing foot in there and not run over or push around any pins. If you do it right, you don't even have to remove the pins while you're sewing it. And I like to put one pin right in the center of the circle just to make sure it stays exactly where I want it to be. When you get to the keyhole, you want to put pins parallel to the keyhole neckline, and give yourself enough room to get your foot of your sewing machine up and down either side of your line on the keyhole. I use chalk, so chalk leaves kind of a fat line, unless you're using flat chalk, but I'm usually not. So my trick is that I will sew, when I get to the keyhole, I will sew down one side of my chalk line and then sew up back the other side of the chalk line. So it gives me a few millimeters of distance between my stitches. And there's a specific purpose for that, because we're actually going to be cutting in between those stitches. So when you sew around your circle, you're going to get to the spot where you drew your keyhole line. You're going to stop and turn and sew down that line, and then you're going to sew a flat bottom at the end of it, and it's only probably going to be 3 or 4 stitches on your sewing machine, and then you're going to sew up the other line back to your circle. And once it's turned inside out, that's going to give us nice, crisp corners on the on the keyhole, on that neckline. It's going to look very clean. So you have to make sure that you leave enough space in between those stitches for you to cut the fabric without undermining the structural integrity of your stitches so that they come loose. You don't want that to happen. So you do need to leave a little bit of space. The width of my chalk line has been perfect for me. Now we are at the sewing machine. Here's a better look at the pins. You can kind of see where I went around the keyhole line there, and that's very important. You can kind of see how I have them spaced out so that I can get my foot in between the rows of needles. And again, we're going to sew around the circle. Now I usually start in the back. It doesn't matter where you start, as long as you know where you started. I put the foot down, and I start sewing around. Go slow so that you can rotate the fabric as you go. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. It doesn't matter if you sew on the inside or the outside of the circle. I usually just sew right on the chalk line when I'm doing the circle. And you just have to rotate the fabric as you push it through. Go a little bit at a time. Make sure you backstitch. Just a little at a time. Take it easy. Doesn't have to go quick. And you can see how I have, most of the time, just enough space. Sometimes you got to take a pin out if it's not quite right, but the less you have to do, the better, right? So just enough space to get between the pins. And then we are at the neckline, the keyhole neckline. So what do we do here? All right, so you stop with your needle down. Make sure your needle is down, not up. If it's up and you pull it out, you're gonna mess the whole thing up. You want to make sure your needle is down. So we're gonna lift our foot and we're gonna rotate it so that we can sew down the keyhole. We rotate. There we go. Put the foot back down and we sew down, and you can see kind of what I was saying before about the chalk line. I'm just on the other side of my chalk line. I'm going to sew down the chalk line. I get to the end, put my foot down, make sure it's down, lift the foot up, keep the needle down, lift the foot up, rotate so that I can sew along the bottom edge, and this is only going to be just a couple of stitches. 2, 3, 4 stitches, something like that. Just enough to go from one end of the chalk line to the other side. 3 stitches, and I usually like to put a back stitch here because it's a point where the fabric is under a lot of pressure sometimes. So I like to go over it a couple of times, and then I lift it up with my needle down, rotate, and now we go back up the side, the opposite side of the keyhole line. And what this does is it gives us a super narrow channel between those 2 stitches to cut the fabric. Do not under any circumstances cross over one of your stitches. If you do that, you just have to cut those stitches and start over. Because you can't form your keyhole if you cross your stitches. If you cut it a little close, sometimes you can make it work. It's better if you cut it too close to just go back and do it again. When you get back to the circle, make sure that your corners on your neckline are relatively even with one another, and then start going around your circle again until you get to where you started. And then make sure you back stitch when you get there. So here you can see that I've sewn, this is kind of the finished part here. You can see you've sewn around the circle. You have a circle, and then you have that little channel going into the neckline there. So it's almost a complete circle except for that one little spot. We take it back to our cat lounge area here, and we start removing the pins. The next step is to cut. We cut our circle out. Now you want to make a tiny little cut on the inside of your stitches. The inside, on the inside of the circle. Not on the outside. Cut the interior of the circle out. Make a little cut and start cutting all the way around. You want to leave a couple millimeters of fabric between your cut and the stitches that you made. Maybe a 1/16 of an inch, something like that. It doesn't have to be a lot, but there needs to be enough there that the fabric is not going to unravel a little bit and pull free from the stitches. That would be bad. Okay, so we have cut out our circle, and now we are going to cut down the keyhole of the neckline. So again, be very careful how you cut. Cut straight down between your stitches. Leave yourself enough room for there to be a tiny little bit of fabric on either side so that it doesn't pull free. Do not cut your stitches at the end of this, at the flat bottom end. Leave yourself, you can cut it pretty close here because there's not a lot of room for the fabric to cut loose or to come loose from the stitch, and hopefully you've backstitched a few times at the end there. And also the fabric needs to fold completely over at that tiny bottom part, and if you leave too much fabric, there will be it'll be lumpy. You don't want that. So it's okay to cut pretty close to your stitches at the very bottom, but everywhere else you want to leave yourself some room. And this is where you get your first look at what the facing will look like when it's done. So as you know, we've done this on the exterior of the tunic. Well, all of this fabric is going to get folded over onto the inside when it gets sewn down, and it'll give you a nice finished look. So when you do that, you can go ahead and do that now, and take something pointy, a pen or maybe the end of your scissors if they're dull enough, and stick them in those corners to kind of poke the corners out to make them nice and crisp. They're not going to want to do that. It's probably not big enough for you to get your finger in there, maybe your pinky finger if you can. But I usually use like a pen or the end of my scissors or something and push those corners all the way out. Now this is why you don't want too much fabric left over around the end of your stitches, because it all needs to fold over and look nice and crisp. And if there's a bunch of fabric left in there, it's gonna bunch up and look lumpy and ugly. So this is kind of what it looks like, or what it will look like when it's done. You can iron it like this if you'd like. It does make things a little bit easier. As I said, I'm a lazy bastard. That's extra work. So as you can tell by the state of my fabric, I didn't iron any of this. This is a crappy fight tunic that I'm making. It's going to get destroyed anyway, so I don't really care. Excuse me, cat. Ugh. The cat is not required for this project, but it does help. So at this point, all that's left is to finish the tunic, which I will actually do by hand. So the facing here, in order to finish the facing, this is again the outside of the tunic. You can see that the seams are on the interior. You can see the armpit gussets here. This is the purpose of the armpit gusset, to give you more room to lift up your arm. This facing is going to get folded like this and tucked over. You just tuck it all over all at once. You don't have to do the folding yet, but that's just how it's going to get hemmed. So you tuck it all up in there like this. You want to pull this bottom part as tight as you can and kind of lay it flat. That is what your seam is going to look like right there. Okay, you kind of want it so that the seam is like on the edge, on the very edge of it. It shouldn't be on the front, it shouldn't be on the back, it should be on the edge. And there's your keyhole. So what we're going to do, I'll show you on this back end here, is when we sew this down, and again I said I'm going to do this by hand, we're going to fold this in like that, and this is going to get sewn down just like that. Okay, and then it's going to go all the way around. Now there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can, with this bottom edge, since it's square, you can do it square and just sew a square like this, boop, all the way up, and then in the back and back down. You can round it all. You can round it and sew it down like that, and then down and around the keyhole. Or you can do a combination of both. I like to do it, honestly, square in the front, round in the back. So I will cut the square of the facing. I'd leave like maybe 2 or 3 inches, cut it in the back, circular to match the neckline, and then I will sew it by hand and sew it down like that in a circular fashion. But then in the front, I like to leave it kind of square. So I'll show you on this tunic. This is one of my wool tunics. This has a big decorative stitch with bright yarn. And you can see it's a little worn out. I've had this tunic for a while, but you can see kind of what I mean. So this is the seam of where the facing is tacked down with this decorative stitch. And you can see on the inside, it's folded over. I folded it square at the bottom. And in the back, it's rounded. Okay? That is all there is to facing. It's super easy. You sew it to the front, cut your neck hole, tuck it in, and sew it on the inside. Super, super easy. Don't overthink it. That 6-inch square, 6-inch circle, and a 3-inch keyhole. God, I can't talk. It will pretty much fit everyone, unless they got a real big head. So, there it is. The secrets of facing.
Raten dos